So, Dr. Sen, shall I start? Or
yes, please.
okay, thank you. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of the JGBS Inspiration Series for Spring 2022. We have started the series in 2020, and over the last 5 semesters, the CREE JGBS Inspiration Series of lectures has attracted, or we have been privileged to have a lot of great academicians who came and delivered a talk for us. Following in the same line, today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Tarun Khanna from the Harvard Business School to be the inaugural speaker of our Inspiration Series with a distinguished lecture in leadership. The session will be moderated by Dr. Mayank Dhaundiyal, Dean, Jindal Global Business School. And before I hand it over to him to take this talk forward, a couple of basic housekeeping rules. For those of you who are attending the talk on Zoom, and I see there are many of you, please try to mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the entire session of the talk. And if you have any questions, type it in the Q&A box, and we will be more than happy to share it with Dr. Khanna. So please keep in mind these 2 basic housekeeping rules. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Dr. Mayank Dhaundiyal, Dean, Jindal Global Business School, to take this forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganguly. A very warm welcome to all of you who joined us on Zoom and YouTube Live for this session on leadership by Dr. Tarun Khanna, a distinguished professor at the Harvard Business School and director of the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, Harvard University, USA. My name is Mayank Dhaundiyal, and I'm the professor and dean at Jindal Global Business School at OP Jindal Global University. Started in 2009, OP Jindal Global University is India's #1 ranked private university with a 1:9 faculty-student ratio, more than 900 globally qualified and internationally recognized faculty members, more than 8,000 students from India and different parts of the world, more than 50 world-class academic programs. JGU is also the only Indian private university in the top 150 young universities in the world, under 50 years of age in the QS Young University Rankings 21. In addition, JGU is also ranked amongst the top 500 universities in the world in international faculty. Jindal Global Business School is the 2nd largest school of JGU as India's premier research-driven business school. With a faculty base of around 110 full-time faculty members, 1,500 students, JGBS run 11 different programs. As part of our vision of being a globally acclaimed business school, developing transformative ideas and people, JGBS is making rapid strides towards excellence. I'm happy to note that in the year 2021, JGBS faculty members published 162 Scopus papers with around 40% in ABDC A and A-star ranked journals. JGBS provides student mobility opportunities to more than 70 universities and B schools across 5 different continents. We are certainly privileged to have a distinguished academic like Dr. Khanna amongst us. After obtaining degrees from Princeton and Harvard, Professor Khanna has taught courses on strategy, corporate governance, international business to MBA and PhD students and senior executives at Harvard Business School since 1993. Professor Tarun Khanna has studied entrepreneurship as a means to social and economic development in emerging markets for over 2 decades now. In 2007, he was nominated the Young Global Leader Under 40 by the World Economic Forum. In 2009, he was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of International Business. In 2016, recognized by the Academy of Management as Eminent Scholar for Lifetime Achievement in the field of international management. Between 2015 and 19, he was appointed to several national commissions by the Government of India, first to chair the effort to frame policies for Entrepreneurship India, but more recently, he's also been part of the commission to help select India's Institutes of Eminence, an attempt to enhance India's leading universities for the future. In this context, I'm glad to share that JGBU JGU has been selected as one of the institutions of eminence, along with much older universities in India, like the Banaras Hindu University, established 1916, University of Delhi, founded in 1922, Aligarh Muslim University in the year 1875, and Punjab University, Chandigarh, which was founded in 1882. Professor Tarun Khanna will be talking today on his new book on leadership, namely Leadership to Last. Without further ado, let me invite today's distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Tarun Khanna. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Mayank, and thank you, all our colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really a privilege to meet all of you, albeit remotely. Thank you for having me. It's been a long time in scheduling this lecture, and I wanted to apologize to Dr. Sen in particular, who has been assiduously chasing me for some years now. But in any event, here we are, and it's a complete pleasure to meet you all virtually. Hopefully sometime in person in the near future. What I thought I would do is share a screen. I put together a few slides for this talk on this new book that my colleague, the historian Geoffrey Jones, and I put together. And I'd like to give you a little bit of context for why we embarked on this exercise. You know, why, after all, another book on leadership? There are literally thousands of them in every bookstore and every airport book kiosk that you can see. So why add to the cacophony of noises? And then try to make the case that there is something that we can learn from some of the extraordinary stories that are presented in this. So bear with me for a second while I try to share my screen, and I'm going to get some help from Dr. Sen as we move along to play some videos also. So this is the, as Dr. Dhaundiyal was saying, this is the title of the book, Leadership to Last, How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind. Somebody can stop me in case it's not visible or something goes wrong, but I'll assume it's okay if I don't hear. As you can see, the word last is intentionally highlighted in a different color and in larger font. And the simple reason for that is that we do, as a society, lionize entrepreneurs. When I say society, I mean not just India, but of course my adopted home in the United States and many other countries around the world, where successful entrepreneurs have their faces splashed on the pages of the newspapers and the websites and so on and so forth. But for the most part, I would say that they are flashes in the pan, that they are episodic successes that have occurred because of somebody's innovation, or frankly, very often somebody's happening to be at the right place at the right time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not at all averse to building a company quickly and even publicly listing it and making a lot of money. More power to everybody who does that. And I participate in that exercise myself, so I'm not throwing stones at anyone. But the exercise here is a little bit different. The exercise here is to say, who are people who have actually reshaped societies? That is a much higher standard than just being a unicorn or a super unicorn. Relative to being a unicorn or super unicorn, this is incomparably harder and I think much more significant. So the exercise that we engaged in was to look around the world and say, who are people who, to general acclaim in each of their societies, whether it's India, of course, but Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa, any of these countries, any of the large emerging markets, or even smaller emerging markets. If you walk down the street and met the average, somewhat educated person and said, who has really reshaped your life in some way, that people would generally agree that these individuals who are profiled in this book and in the underlying database from which the book is drawn, about which I'll speak in a second, there will be no ambiguity that they are significant figures, right? So that's the exercise here. It's about lasting institutional change triggered by individual creativity and entrepreneurial action. And the result of this is that they leave legacies behind, hence the subtitle of the book. So why we wrote this book? Perhaps the first reason is, I've been teaching in a school of business and management, and at one of the one of the good universities in the world for a long time. And both as a student at Harvard many years ago, even though my high school and early schooling was in India, my undergraduate degree and graduate degrees were in the US. And it's just very obvious to someone who grew up in India but is living in the US that all the stories of people that we lionize, here at least in the Western world, are all local heroes, so to speak. It's Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Warren Buffett and people like that. Those are the stories that are in the air and are easy to access. But you know, and I know that we have plenty of iconic leaders in our own country, in India. We have plenty of iconic leaders in pretty much every country that I've been privileged enough to work in the last 20 to 30 years. And what about their stories? Can we not learn something from them? So the exercise here is a scholarly exercise primarily, which is how do we learn from these stories? Now, any social scientist would tell you, I think, that you learn, first of all, from sample variation. You just can't learn by restricting yourself to a very small exposition of the human experience. You must broaden your underlying data from which you extrapolate. It's sort of like somebody, let me make a silly example, right? Somebody says, I want to figure out the defining characteristic of all animals. Suppose that's the exercise that a would-be academic sets himself. And he goes and only studies the dogs in his neighborhood. And he concludes that all animals bark. That would be an erroneous conclusion because lots of animals exist and they don't bark. So that's the exercise here, is that much of our scholarship, I would say the vast majority, even in India, are drawn from, unwittingly or wittingly drawn from stories that are a much smaller sample, much smaller subset of the human experience than is legitimate. So that's the first exercise here, is that we wanted to dramatically expand the scope of available stories to the world. Now, I think as a research institution that is fortunate enough to be, I think, generally respected around the world and have resources, it's very important to us that this is a public good, that this is free to the world. So we have expended enormous resources at Harvard over the last 10 odd years to put together what currently I think is between 150 and 175 hour to at least an hour-long video interviews of individual iconic leaders who often don't speak to the press at all. Sometimes they do, but often they don't speak to the press at all. But because I think we are able to go to them with honesty and reassure them that this is for academic purposes, that we want to make your story available to academics, students around the world, practitioners of management, so that they can learn from it. People have been enormously candid and very kind to spend endless amount of time with us. So if you go to the website for the Creating Emerging Markets project at the Harvard Business School, you will see literally hundreds and hundreds of video clips that you can download and use for free. And that's the exercise. So my request to the leadership of the OP Jindal University is to disseminate it and use it really in every way and give us feedback on how it could be improved. So that's the first thing, variation in leadership settings. I already spoke about the second, leadership that lasts. This book is not about get rich quick schemes, build a company and take it public. I participated in the exercise of building a company and taking it publicly myself, and I enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun, and sometimes you do very well, and all that's great, but that's not this exercise. This is about lasting institutional change in emerging markets around the world. And the third thing I'd say is that, I'm trained as an applied mathematician, and I would generally say I'm more of a quantitative person than a qualitative person. But it's dawned on me as I've grown older and I hope more mature, that really the most powerful thing in the human imagination is the power of storytelling, the power of narration. That's how we communicate as human beings for the most part. Think about when you hang out with your friends. In Hindi, we say, "Kisi adde mein jaakar baith jao," and you tell a story, right? So it's so much easier to communicate with images and voices and stories, and that's what you see come out in these management lessons from from hundreds of interviews, several hundreds of video clips, and so on. So those are the three reasons why we thought that we would write this book, to bring a small subset of the stories that are in the book to the attention of the reading public, but more importantly, to direct people to the underlying website. Here's a snapshot of what's currently up on the website. You'll see on the right is my good friend Kiran Mazumdar from Bangalore, talking about her story. In the middle is another really good friend, James Mwangi from Kenya, who's the creator from scratch of the biggest financial institution, Equity Bank, across East Africa, possibly one of the biggest on the African continent, now moving aggressively into fintech for financial inclusion. A lot that we can learn from him, and a lot that our other stories can contribute back to the African experience. And on the left is a gentleman, Vinod Chaudhary, of the Chaudhary Group from Kathmandu, Nepal. Now, these are just three that happen to be right on the front today. But that's the website, the Creating Emerging Markets Project at the Harvard Business School. So what did we learn from this exercise? I'm going to just talk through really quickly these three, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Sen to play sequentially three 1 or 2 minute video clips, and then I'll comment on each video clip as we go along. So the first thing we learned is that entrepreneurs lead with this. This sounds obvious, and it is, but I think it's worth reiterating. Entrepreneurs lead with both ideas and actions. What do I mean by that? What I'm trying to say is that no society reshaping enterprise was ever created out of a classroom setting. People didn't sit down with a yellow pad or a chalkboard or a simulation engine or a laptop and say, this is the society changing enterprise I'm going to create. It required an iteration between ideas in brainstorming sessions, perhaps in classrooms, perhaps in boardrooms, perhaps in somebody's living room, garage, and then a very messy encounter with the real world. I'm reminded of the quote that some famous general said that, the military plans are all great until you hit the reality of war. And then you've got to throw it out and restart. I'm currently in the middle of building India's largest tea chain, sort of something that we had conceived of as a Starbucks for the masses, called Chai Point, which has a decent presence in Delhi and Bangalore and about 10 other cities. And is very much of a tech-based tea chain, if you will. And we've had to change our plans so dramatically as we go along in the last several years. So it's this interplay between ideas. There is an animating idea, of course, behind every great organization, but it is forged in the crucible of experience. You have to be out there and get slapped around and refine your ideas. And be brave and bold and willing to do that, and use data and narrative to understand the experience. And I think it's a profoundly creative act to build something lasting. The second is, this is very important, particularly in the developing countries, I think, that entrepreneurs lead from within the organization, of course, as we expect them to, but they equally lead in shaping the context. Now, I wouldn't say a defining characteristic, but a common characteristic of the developing countries is that the state doesn't quite function as a textbook state should. The mandate of the state is to represent the people, ideally, and to provide so-called public goods, whether it's clean water, basic electricity, healthcare, and so on. And we can look around our own country, India, and even though there's been dramatic progress made in the last few decades, there's still a very long way to go. So the question is, if you're a would-be entrepreneur and you want to build an enterprise that is both world-class and society reshaping, what should your stance be to the generalized absence of public goods on which ideally you would rely? Now, I often tell my students at Harvard and MIT, if you're sitting in our classroom and you happen to have a new idea, it's not easy to build an enterprise, but it's a lot easier than building it in the developing world. And I'm an active participant in the Bangalore ecosystem, co-founder of one of the biggest incubators in Bangalore, Axelor, So I know what it's like there. But even compared to something like Bangalore, it's a lot easier in Boston to make something happen, simply because we are fortunate enough to have deep pools of risk capital. We have dozens and dozens of academic institutions, within a 10 square mile area that have been around for, in some cases, hundreds of years. So the institutional infrastructure in which you can free ride, if you will, as an entrepreneur is quite extensive. If I'm sitting in a smaller city in India or in Brazil or in Nigeria, how do I go about doing it? Well, it seems that there are conceptually two different approaches you could take. You could complain, which isn't very productive. You could say, well, that's the role of the government or the state, and I'm going to wait for that to happen, in which case hell would freeze over and your professional life would pass before anything happened. Or you can roll up your sleeves and exercise leadership in shaping the context, even though you won't be the only beneficiary of your actions on that stem. And that's what you see in all these stories, that they have been very proactive about taking people along with them and not saying, what's a simple example? One of the clips I'll show you is of my super good friend and even mentor, if I may call him that, Devi Shetty, the heart surgeon in Bangalore. Really interesting guy. I watched his story from day zero almost. And he's played, if not the key role, an important role in pioneering health insurance in India. Now, he doesn't want to be a health insurer. He wants to be a cardiac surgeon, a pediatric cardiac surgeon. So why is he doing health insurance? Because he sees that that's part of the infrastructure that's missing. It has to be put in place. And once it's put in place, he can get out of that sector and let the specialists take it over. And the benefits of there being a health insurance sector, of course, will accrue to lots of people, including other competitors of his in some ways. And that's fine. That's what I mean by exercising leadership, is not so much wanting to take on the roles of the state, but realizing that in the professional lifetimes that typical entrepreneurs would have, they have to roll up their sleeves and do something, exercise leadership outside your organization as well as inside it. The last thing I'd say is, if you look at the stories in our book or in the Creating Emerging Markets database, there are plenty of stories of leadership from large incumbent organizations that are in their fifth and sixth and seventh generations. I'm reminded of my very good friend, Jaime Augusto Zubel de Ayala. I think he's the sixth or seventh generation of his family in the Philippines, building an enormously large enterprise that has played a central role in the development of Manila city and the Philippines as a country. Very innovative, extremely innovative entity within an established incumbent enterprise. In fact, have pioneered the telecom sector in that country in the last 10, 15 years, and several others. And then you have, de novo, so-called startups that have also reshaped their societies. So that's a summary of a very aggregate 50,000-foot view of lessons that we've learned. And I think now I'm going to ask, rather than show, I'm going to stop sharing and ask. There are video clips which I have on my laptop, but I'm worried about the buffering, so it may not show clearly. So I requested Dr. Sen to play them instead. Dr. Sen, can you play the first one, please? I'll stop sharing.
Yes, Dr. Khanna, there is someone at the auditorium present, and they'll be playing the first one. So, Devi,
okay, thank you.
The Devi Shetty video. Do you want to play the Devi Shetty video, Dr. Khanna?
Yes, please. Yeah, in the order that just any of the videos.
Yeah, so we're just playing the first video and just.
Okay, thank you.
20. Six or 27 years ago, when I did the first heart surgery, I clearly remember patient paid today's equivalent of $2,000 for a heart operation. 26 years later, they're paying $1,200. Nothing in this world in service. What was $2,000, 26 years later has come down to $1,200. It's only by economy of scale. Today, we are privileged about 12% of the heart surgery done in India is done by us. So we have the companies which supply products, they look at us differently. And we have converted our hospital as an academic institution. Every hospital we build, we treat it like an academic institution to train young people. And more than anything else, we are very, very conscious of the quality. The cheapest way to produce something is to make it the best in first attempt.
Why is that?
Then you don't have to repair it again. If you fix the heart properly during the first time, you don't need to take back the patient for a re-exploration or give them massive quantity of blood.
Okay, so let me just make a comment on that. I think, so he starts with a very interesting observation, right? That there is no service in the world. And note the distinction between service industry and a product, right? So I'm holding an iPhone, and on a per unit of computing power basis, this device, which is like a supercomputer of the old days, is incredibly cheap, right? It's a lot cheaper. Your Android phone, on a per unit of computing power basis, the price has dropped precipitously. But that is not true of services. Look at the cost of higher education. Look at the cost of higher end medical care. It's generally skyrocketed. But what he's saying is that at his hospital, the cost of cutting edge cardiac surgery has fallen over the last 20 years, which is a service business, right? He's not talking about the products that are used to do heart surgery. He's talking about the act of doing the surgery. And how has that happened? That, I think, is a brilliant innovation that has caused, surgeries that cost, tens of thousands of dollars around the world, and in my backyard are just ridiculously expensive, to be, $1,000 in India. And that's a management innovation, 100%. And what he's put in place is a system that allows him to do that. And one of the things that I learned a lot from Devi, that is spelled out a little bit in the book and in the video clips and in the interviews that he gave us, is just the extent to which he has exercised one of the themes that I was just talking about, which is don't just concentrate on building out within the Narayana group of hospitals, which is his organization, but exercise leadership outside and shaping the context. So whether it's in health insurance that I mentioned, whether it's in telemedicine, working with ISRO, the Indian Space Organization, working with medical device companies, working with the government and the regulators to come up with sensible regulations, trying somewhat unsuccessfully, one must say, but trying anyway, to reform medical education, which is a disaster in many instances, in India as in other places, in the sense that it just doesn't produce enough doctors and professionals. But along the way, he's really tried to shape the ecosystem in some sense. So those are the lessons I'm going to take away from Devi's experience. Let's play the second one. Maybe the actress, Shabana Azmi, if we could play her little video clip. Totally different context. I just picked three that I happen to think were interesting right off the bat from India.
Hi, Amnish. Can we play the Shabana Azmi video, please? Yeah.
Thank you.
I grew up believing that art should be used as an instrument for social change, and the work that I did, particularly when it comes to the portrayal of women, where I have actively turned down roles that show that it's kosher for women to be subservient. I've actually not done those films, even when I was offered a lot of money, and have done roles in which I probably didn't get paid at all, but I thought that it would be raising the bar for women and their rights. Because I think that it is important to build up contesting voices because of the multiplicity of interests that we have in a country like India. So cinema has a very important role to play in changing the mores of society, particularly when it comes to women. Earlier, violence against women was portrayed.
Did we lose it?
Hey, we're just checking through.
Okay.
Streaming all right. I think it's probably stuck on the auditorium device, but on the other devices, it's streaming all right.
Okay. All right. Well, let me just comment on what Ms. Azmi is saying for a second. The reason I like her interview a lot is, well, there's several things really. One, obviously, it's so some of the panelists are saying, I mean, some of the people on Zoom and on YouTube are saying it's not streaming. So your local tech team is not able to do it. Anyway, let me just comment on Ms. Azmi's interview. Obviously, it's a story about gender, right? Now, we know that India's record on gender equity is really quite dismal. It has to be called out. As a son, a brother, husband, and a father of a young lady, I'm just horrified. Even in this day and age, even now, if you go on social media, just today, you will see horrific videos of men in India harassing women. And I just have to call it out as being abysmally unfortunate, disgusting. Mayank, you and I and anybody who's in any position of any remote authority has to speak out about this. That's why I put Shabana Azmi's video up front. And she's trying to take a stand and say that, look, and this is another thing that I, even as an applied math guy, resonate with very strongly, that art, storytelling, narration is a powerful leadership tool. It's how you change people's mindsets and behavior. And after that, you can get to the analytic models and all that kind of stuff, right? That I used to think are the centerpiece of excellence. They're an important building block, nothing wrong with them. But before that, you have to appeal to human biases, human emotions, human storytelling and narration, and build on that edifice in some way. So I like Shabana Azmi's video clip and her interview because it's up front and center on this important leadership exercise. Even though it comes from a non-traditional sector where we may not look for management leadership lessons, I think it's worth highlighting. And in the book also, that it reminds me to make another point. In the book also, we're not just profiling for-profit enterprises. It's the vast majority of for-profit enterprises. But remember, the book is about leadership. It's not about making tons of money. Now, making tons of money is a corollary or a byproduct of exercising good leadership. But impact and influence and the reshaping of societies that we set out to study doesn't only come from building for-profit enterprises. So a number in there that are really fabulous. Ella Bhatt of Seva is another one that really jumps to mind as somebody whose story really deserves to be called out, both from the gender equity side as well as the building an amazing social nonprofit side. And there are many, many more in the book. Okay, let's to the tech team. Do you want to try the third video of Mr. Tata? Let's see if that one works, hopefully, fingers crossed.
That's another interesting issue, right? Sitting in India, which is, for maybe half the population that needs products and services at a particular price point, getting the market to work for you in support of those goals has, I think, proven to be quite difficult. I mean, you have the isolated success. Is that a statement that you would agree with, or is that overstating it?
My own assessment is that the market is very demanding of such products. Mm-hmm. It's a very sensitive market in the sense, if you have a calamity, you can't give secondhand clothing or yesterday's food no one wants to be seen or categorized as getting a handout. So whatever one does, one mistake that one makes of trying to show that we're doing it for the person who can't afford to get something else is the wrong approach. You can get the price there, but you have to market the product as being just as good as everything else. The Nano should have been viewed as something that could be in a garage that has a Bentley on the one hand and a Nano to go to the market. Not something that someone who couldn't afford a car can now afford to get a car. That's
The wrong.
some of the mistake we made. So I think the base of the pyramid is keen to have its own place and status in the hierarchy of the consuming public, which one needs to respect more than we have been
Historically.
doing.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So that Ratan Tata is somebody that I really look up to for just so many different reasons. Most of all is humility, and I think that really comes through in that video, because as you can see, he's saying, "Look, we made a mistake in how we presented the Nano. It was something that was very close to him, to his engineering heart, to his passion with automobiles and planes and what have you." And if I recall correctly, it was positioned as the people's car. But what he says is that it was misinterpreted as being a car that you bought if you couldn't get a better one. And that's not how people want to think of themselves. They don't want to think of themselves as, I bought this because I couldn't get a better one. It should have been positioned as, aapke paas badi gaadi hai, ye bhi rakh lo garage mein. You've got a big car, but what the heck, have this one also on the side, right? So that you can use this to go bring your sabzi, rather than pulling out the big fat fancy car with the driver to go around the corner. So it was an error in understanding mass consumer psychology. So I thought it was just a very nice 1-minute clip that tells you something about a huge mistake that a company made, that a very well-run, celebrated company made. And the other thing I would say is about the videos. What Ratan is demonstrating there is enormous humility. Remember, we are going to iconic leaders who, almost by definition, have been in the business of creating enterprises for 30, 40, 50 years in some instances. So they don't have anything to prove to anybody, right? They're already seen as leaders. So they are extremely thoughtful and extremely humble. It's not a puff piece to tell you a story of how great I am. We all know how great they are. That's already been done. This is more, let me reflect on the arc of my career. In fact, I always start the interviews, whichever ones I do. I should say that, of the 150, 170 interviews, maybe 20 are done by me, but the rest of the 130, 140, 150 are done by 20, 30 different faculty. It's very much a collaborative project. But whenever I do an interview, I always start by saying, can you please just reflect on the broad arc of your career and tell us anything that you think stands out that's worthy of recollection for you and for people who might view the videos. And I leave it completely unscripted. I just let them go and then just have a conversation. So what happens is that the videos, really, for the most part, I can't think of anybody who comes across to me anyway as arrogant in any way. And I think that is something that should recommend them to all of us, because they become the utility as teaching and research vehicles is dramatically enhanced as a result. So it gives you a flavor of the videos, right? And again, I would say it's a public good. I'd encourage anybody to go and just download it and see what can be learned from it. So let me just share my screen one more time and then close with this last thing. I end the book by saying, I'm going to pull up, I have a copy of the book. This book is only available in India and South Asia. So I only have one copy. I have not been able to get more in in Boston. But there is a line that I wanted to read to you, if I may, in the introduction that ends the introduction. If you don't do anything else, just read the introduction. It's 3 pages. So read that. So, and at the end, I say, Jeff and I say, our overall takeaway is simple. We are just humbled by the combination of audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose displayed by the giants whose life lessons are narrated here. And I think that sums it up. It's a privilege to have been the steward of this database with Jeff and to continue to build it with 20-odd colleagues at Harvard and to make this dramatic exercise of the public good. Thank you for giving me a small platform, for meeting you all. I'm very grateful for the privilege and for your attention, and happy to engage in a discussion in the 20-odd minutes we have left. Dr. Sen or Dr. Dhaundiyal, back to you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Khanna. That was a very insightful, informative session. Of course, you have done a lot of work on emerging markets and entrepreneurship. So that seems to have caught your fancy. And I've read your earlier book, Billions of Entrepreneurs. That was also a very fascinating read. Of course, Leadership to Last is also very interesting because, as you correctly point out, that, you talk about sustainability, you talk about traits that, make these organizations, exist over a period of time. And I think that's, extremely important in this day and age. So we have a few questions coming up. Would that be okay if I ask you one by one?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
At some point in time, we'll also go to our students and try to, get questions from them as well. So, in your book, this Leadership to Last, you and your team have interviewed entrepreneurs, leaders from countries that I think account for roughly 43% of the world's population. In other words, 80% of the world outside the OECD group of countries. So, in today's increasingly multipolar world, what do you think is the significance of these non-OECD countries in the context of leadership and entrepreneurship? So, in other words, whatever make leadership to last in emerging economies, do you think it's different from those in the developed economy?
So Mayank, I would say, first of all, let's recognize the moment that we are obviously in the world, right? You've got Mr. Putin's barbaric assault, and even though India is not calling it out as being barbaric, I'm calling it out as being barbaric. It's just unacceptable, and we've got a schism between the US and China emerging and becoming more and more solid over time. We have the world kind of moving away from the globalization that we saw in the last few decades, moving towards generally more towards isolationism and unhealthy isolationism, I think. But what that means is that we're much more likely to be, when I say we, I mean people in different emerging markets, whether again you're Brazilian or Nigerian or Indian or Indonesian, you're much more likely to be living increasingly influenced by your own immediate ambiance than by events happening elsewhere. I'm overstating it just to make a point. And I think the local context becomes dramatically more important or increasingly more important as time passes. And what you see in these stories, this was the second of the two learnings that I put up at the beginning of this, of my comments, is that entrepreneurs seeking to make a difference in societies are going to have to exercise leadership in their context around them, that they're going to have to reshape it in ways that suit their own societal fabric. Now, this is a theme I've been harping on for 2 decades now. My earliest exploration, which you alluded to, was a narrative book that I wrote, Billions of Entrepreneurs. based on my wandering around India and China, not just in the Shanghais and the Mumbais of the two countries, but at the backwaters in some ways of both countries, learning the language in China a little bit and really getting around and realizing that at a very high level, the principles of whatever you want to call it, strategy or management or leadership are universal. Right? Of course, we want to motivate people. But when you get down to Monday morning realities in each country, the way you go about motivating people is quite different in different places. It has to be sensitive to the cultural and social and political idiom in that society. The instruments available to motivate people are really quite different. Whether you use compensation or something else, how you use it is quite different in different places. So as you become more and more on the ground, the implementation of a management idea or a leadership principle becomes more and more contextually determined. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. The comment that you made about 40% of the world's population and 80% of the non-OECD world's population is exactly right. As I said earlier, I don't think it's sufficient for us to, as particularly those of us who are in the academic field, to rely only on Bill Gates and Elon Musk as prototypical exemplars. Of course, extraordinary individuals, but there's so many more, and sample variation is very important to any social scientist worth his or her salt. So let me pause with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have another question coming in. So, they say the chapters in your book follow a theme, and you have grouped companies under common themes of managing families, committing to values, innovating for impact, contesting corruption, challenging gender stereotypes, promoting inclusion, and creating value. So, how did you decide on these major themes? And second, would these themes also sort of be relevant in a developed economy settings, or it's a subset would be only relevant in the developed economy?
Oh no, I think every theme is relevant in Boston also, and London and New York. Absolutely, every theme is relevant. They're pretty general themes. We organized it in this way. I'm kind of opening the book to remind myself from the table of contents. We organized it in this way, rather than lionizing an individual person. My friend Mo Ibrahim, who built Africa's biggest cell phone company, part of which is now owned by the Sunil Mittal's Airtel. But Mo was a pioneer, is a pioneer. He was a pioneer when he built the initial company. You could have written a whole chapter on Mo, right? Or Fadi Ghandour in the Emirates, in Dubai and the Emirates, building Aramex, an amazing logistics company. That without that you couldn't get anything in the Middle East for a long time. You could write whole chapters on individuals like this. But we felt that the idea here was not to lionize individuals. The idea was to extract lessons so these are already lionized individuals. They're already celebrities. They're not interested in being lionized, if I may say it in that way. And your question put it correctly, I think, implicitly correctly anyway, that we have gender stereotypes in Boston also. We have dramatic inequality in every society, in the UK, in China, in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, in the US. And it's a moment in time when these conundrums need to be more called out. And again, we need to expand the sample from which we can learn lessons so that we can address these otherwise quite intractable social problems.
Thank you very much. So I would request all the students who are joining us on Zoom, as well as people in the auditorium there, to write the questions in the chat box. We have a couple more and more pouring in from other mediums. So Mr. Vishal Pandey, he asks, Satya Nadella, known for humility, versus Steve Ballmer. Is there anything like right idea or better leadership?
Look, I know both Satya and Steve, and I'm fond of them both. I can't say I know either of them super well, but I know them both. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus. I mean, personally, I like the humble style. And Satya comes across that way, of course. Steve does not. Steve is very loud, but he's a very inspirational and motivating person to large groups of people. So I'm not comfortable, advocating for one style. I'm comfortable for an individual deciding, how to fit in his or her own skin and be true to oneself. And if I may say it this way, to wear your heart on your sleeve so that people can see where you're coming from. And I think that goes a long way. I think transparency and open-mindedness and willingness to acknowledge one's limitations, and I have, as my wife would tell you, have a long list of limitations, goes a long way in allowing people to work with you. And at the end of the day, you're trying to catalyze people to work together. That's why I love the Devi Shetty interview. It's not like he's doing all the things to repair the societal fabric, but he's managing to convince people to go along with him, right? Or sticking with Bangalore, Kiran Mazumdar, the same way. She's motivating young scientists. She's motivating young women scientists in particular, and is sort of a evangelist for life sciences in the Bangalore ecosystem. And that's a contribution to society beyond Biocon or beyond Narayana hospitals. So whatever comes naturally to you, because if you try to copy somebody else, it's not going to work.
Thank you very much. We have questions pouring in now from all directions. So, another question for you. So in the book, there is mention of, the liberalization period where India was in the desperate need of liberalizing its economy. And now we see government showing a lot of support for the local industry, vocal for local, as it is popularly known. So in your opinion, what is the optimum balance between being self-reliant and liberalization? Actually, this is an interesting question, especially, in today's context. So although on one hand, we see that the rapid advance of technology, has made multi-country supply chains feasible and even desirable, in multiple contexts. Now, there are obvious, limits to that. Tom Friedman's analogy of world is flat, right? But if we see, and you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine, situation, and the consequent sanctions, and many countries are now feeling the need, to be reliant in multiple, industries, because they feel that tomorrow, for whatever reasons, they might, be in that situation. So in your opinion, what is the optimum balance you think between being self-reliant and opening up your economy for foreign investment?
So it's a great question, and it's a very, very, very topical one, as you know. And even prior to the Russia-Ukraine debacle, we had COVID, right? And we were caught unawares. So many societies, including the United States. I remember the beginning days of it. My wife is a dentist, oral surgeon in Boston, and that profession was on the absolute front lines of COVID, because you have to take care. And what more dramatic way to be exposed to aerosols and virus than being in an operating theater with patients? And the Hippocratic Oath says that you can't say no. You have to take care of your patients. So of course, she was on the front lines from pretty much, I think, week 3 or week 4. But there was no masks anywhere in Boston. There were no masks. I literally had to work the phones, Mayank, to get my students from inner China to ship me masks before the Chinese government stopped the shipment of masks, and before the US government figured out that masks were coming into our practice. And then we were distributing it to hospitals here because we had access to it. So that self-reliance issue is not just, India specific or any country specific. A lot of countries are understanding that there's a role for buffer stocks of critical items. And now I can just see all my supply chain mathematics optimization colleagues redoing the models to say, if the cost of stockouts is higher than we ever envisaged, both physical costs and social costs of stockouts, being caught unawares for critical inventory items, whether they're health items or critical ingredients in a manufacturing process, is much higher than what we thought because of irreducible uncertainty in predicting the state of nature in some years out. Then, of course, there's going to be more of a role for buffer stocks and more of a role in the direction of self-reliance. I think it'd be a catastrophic mistake to throw the baby out with the bathwater and go only all in favor of local firms. And as academics, as I hope part of the conscience of societies, I think our role is to call out excess on any side, which is what I intend to do in my own small way. So there is a recalibration going on. I certainly agree with it, and it's a sensible recalibration in wake of the isolationist tendencies that have emerged in the past few years. And that's appropriate to some extent, but not to overdo it. My guess is the pendulum will swing too far in the other direction and then we'll recorrect in a few years. So.
Right. So Dr. Khanna, I mean, I'm just trying to do a time check here. I mean, how much time do you think?
Well, I have 5-6 minutes. We can go a few more if necessary. But
wonderful. No, I have because I asked you because I have a list of questions, and I'm sure that
No, just pick some. I mean, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So we are with the one of the I think Mr. Rakesh is asking, dear Tarun sir, from your experience, what does leadership mean if you have to explain it to a layman?
Explain what language? In English? Leadership, what does it mean? I think it just means taking people along with you.
All right.
And inducing them to do something that hopefully is constructive. You could lead and do something dramatically bad, but let's leave that out. But taking people along with you to do something collectively for societal good, that's how I would say it. I think that translates into at least a few languages that I speak. So, yeah.
All right. So let me just add an add-on question to it. So, there has been a great emphasis on values, right? And how a leader should have certain values. So what all values do you think is essential for a leader to have in them? And, or can these values be actually inculcated, or these values something which a person is born with?
You're asking the age-old nature-nurture debate question, which I can't pretend to be wise enough to add anything at all to it. No, look, I think that there's certainly a role for getting better at trying to do what I just said leadership was, which is getting people to work collectively towards some common societal purpose. You can certainly learn to get better at it, and I'll just point to those phrases that I used at the end of my talk, the audacity of intent. In other words, these people all have big, big goals. They may not have had big goals when they started their enterprises, but it got shaped in the crucible of life experiences to become something like, Kiran wants to work on science-based health for the world. Devi wants to treat everybody of all diseases for $1 a day anywhere in the world. That's an insane goal, but it's doable. Mathematically, it's doable. Zia Modi wants to work on gender equity for professional women all over India. Right? So these are big goals. So audacity of intent is a big thing. Humility of demeanor that you saw in Ratan Tara's clip. And then taking the long view, steadfastness of purpose. So Akash has a comment saying that Putin, well, that's why I said, is Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, a leader, or Putin? I think that's an easy one. I mean, I said there has to be a constructive purpose. I think hopefully we can all agree that Putin's purpose is not constructive. So, that doesn't seem like it fits my bill. He's obviously a leader, but towards, I think, a very bad end. So anyway.
Right. I think Dr. Sain has, he's raised his hand, so I think he wants to ask a question. Dr. Sain?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, yes.
He's exercising his prerogative. Yes.
Absolutely, cutting the queue here. So my question to you is that you get to interact with some of the brightest minds in your classroom every day, and you have several times during this lecture in your book you have mentioned about this audacity of intent, but with great intent also comes great responsibility. So we have seen in the last several years that that great responsibility some are missing, right? So we have seen in the many instances where young entrepreneurs we have discussed. I have actually discussed these cases with some of my MBA students in my class, where that responsibility was somewhere missing, and which kind of created problems for the investors and their potential customers. For the case which I have discussed in the class was of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you see in your classroom? So, is there a tendency towards becoming a more ethical leader? So, making money is the most, is the biggest prerogative in any which means that might be, or the students they have a more longer run to become a visionary leader, that kind of a perspective. Which way do you think the next kind of leadership will sway?
I don't know. I wish I could, Dr. Sen, I wish I could say that yes, there is a move towards greater ethics or greater consciousness of leadership. But I'm not sure I can say that. In all honesty, I'm not sure that there's any evidence that that's the case. I'm not sure it's getting worse either. I'm not sure it's getting better. What I can say is that I think, at least speaking for my institution, and I'm really not competent to speak about broader than that, but for whatever it's worth, in one institution, we are taking ethics and leadership values very, very seriously, much more seriously than when I was a student at HBS 30 plus years ago. We had, of course, lots of sessions where leadership issues came up and ethical issues came up. And values in general came up, but we didn't have a dedicated time to shine a light on it. And I think, if I remember correctly, and this may be incorrect, but I'm quite sure I'm broadly in the right ballpark. It was after the Enron scandal, the collapse of Enron, a celebrated company, which was celebrated by a lot of my colleagues as being amazing company, and it turned out to be built on fraud. And it collapsed. And of course, we had a lot of Harvard Business School graduates in that company leading it. So it really caused us to pause and say, and there was a debate, as I remember, about how much can you shape a person's ethics by the time we see them in their late 20s, mid to late 20s or early 30s. Our values already, basically acquired on your grandma's lap. But we decided, and I think correctly, that we should make a concerted effort to remind people that they have a societal and a human responsibility above and beyond building a successful, quote unquote, successful company. And I want to think that that has paid off in the last 10, 15 years, but I think time will tell. That's an honest answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanna. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Dr. Khanna. I think you've got to go, so we'll end it here. This was an extremely informative session, and I'm sure our students, faculty, and staff members have benefited immensely from this session. So on behalf of Jindal Global University, the Jindal Global Business School, and the Center for Research and Emerging Economies, I would like to sincerely thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and delivering this session on leadership in the context of your new book, Leadership to Last. I would, really request and nudge every one of you to, go through that book. I think It's a wonderful, wonderful narration of qualities that are really required for building sustainable organizations. On that note, I would like to once again, thank Dr. Khanna for his time. Thank you very much, sir. We really hope that
Thank you so much.
to make time and visit us, in person at some point in time in the future.
You're all very kind. I was very grateful to be invited, and very nice of you to have put up with my difficult schedule and let me have this platform. Have a lovely rest of the evening, and thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Khanna. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.